Thank you, Glenn. And thank you, Susan. I'm a somewhat unlikely presence here and thrilled to be here. So not being a scholar, and decidedly not a scholar of Kant, I'm not going to endeavor to, I feel as though we've been moving through history, and here we're hitting essentially the present, and sort of Kant hovers behind, I think, what I'm going to say. I wanted to talk about time because it's much on my mind, and because it has been, I think, one of the universals upon which nominally we all thought we could agree, and that we can see through the 19th and 20th centuries the universalization of time, which has had particular effects, and now maybe changing again. And I wanted to actually take as an epigraph for what I'm about to say a line from Leah Ipi's, from the acknowledgments of Leah Ipi's wonderful memoir. When it's difficult to see clearly into the future, you have to think about what you can learn from the past. So I'm going to open by reading just a couple of pages from the prologue of my new novel, which was just published a month ago, and it's called This Strange Eventful History, and I'll say a little bit about it in a minute. The character who speaks in the prologue then doesn't appear again until the middle of the book. I'm a writer. I tell stories. I want to tell the stories of their lives. It doesn't really matter where I start. We're always in the middle. Wherever we stand, we see only partially. I know also that everything is connected, the constellations of our lives moving together in harmony and disharmony. The past swirls along with and inside the present, and all time exists at once around us. The ebb and flow, the harmonies and dissonance, the music happens whether or not we describe it. A story is not a line, it is a richer thing, one that circles and eddies, rises and falls, repeats upon itself. And so this story, the story of my family, has many possible beginnings or none. Mare Nostrum, St. Augustine, Abdelkader, Charles de Gaulle, my parents, Larba, my father, my aunt, Zora Drift, my mother, Albert Camus, Toronto, Cambridge, Toulon, Tlemcen, oh, Tlemcen. All and each a part of the vast and intricate web, any version only partial. Or I could begin with my birth, or my father's birth, or his father's birth, or my mother's or grandmother's. I could begin with the secrets and shame, the ineffable shame that in telling their story, I would wish at last to heal. The shame of the family history, of the history into which we were born. How to forget that after attending the birth of his first grandson, my father, elderly then, tripped on the curb and fell in the street, a toppled mountain, and as he lay with the white down of his near bald head in the gutter's muck, he muttered not help me, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I could begin, of course, with the aloneness. Or I could begin with the fact that the owner of our local pizzeria and our former next-door neighbor is an Algerian man whose surname is also the name of the provincial Algerian town of his ancestors, the same town in which my Pied Noir grandmother taught at the girls' school in her youth, in the years before she married, years that were in her case numerous because she didn't marry till her mid-30s, then an age by which women were deemed unmarriageable. She might even have taught my neighbor's grandmother or great-grandmother. Or I could begin with the fact that the beloved Lebanese friends of my grandfather's pre-war posting in Beirut include the great-uncle of a dear friend of mine in this American life almost a century later, whose daughter played with our son from the time they were round-limbed toddlers. Or I could begin with the angels on my father's last journey to death, the witnesses to his many lives who appeared, sentinels and guides along that final path to guide him, the ultimately homeless, to his eternal home. It doesn't matter so much where this story begins as that it begins. And if, as I've come to understand, the story is infinitely expanding rather than a line or thread, then wherever I start is merely that, not the beginning, but a mere moment, a way of happening, a mouth. So I've just published a novel, which spans 70 years from 1940 to 2010 and 4 continents with 5 different points of view, the sort of novel that as a writing teacher you encourage your students not to undertake. And yet, as the Australian writer Peter Carey once said to me, if it doesn't seem impossible, it's not worth doing. The paragraphs that I just read from the prologue are in the voice of a character, Chloe Cassar, who doesn't then appear again until halfway through the book, and essentially they amount to an assertion of the novel's raison d'être, embracing narrative both as a bulwark against time's depredations, as in Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and as its own type of speech act, with always Nabokov's idea that a work of fiction involves the writer and the reader climbing the mountain from opposite sides to meet at the top. What was the quotation? Who said the best books are the ones that the reader writes half? Voltaire, there we go. My ideal intention as a novelist is to create out of words a set of experiences so vivid that they come to exist in a reader's mind, fully imagined by the reader, informed, of course, by the reader's own histories and temperament, each reader's experience therefore unique to them, alongside and in my fantasy indistinguishable from their actual experiential memories. That's to say, a reader might, months later, associatively lend in their memory upon a detail from my novel and think for a moment that it rose from experienced life. Darian Leader, in his book What is Madness, proposes that we're all psychotic, really, busy projecting our fantasy narratives onto the world around us, but that most of the time we know not to share these fantasies with the world. He cites the marvelous example of a woman who was certain that if she retained her virginity for 30 years, she'd be given a large sum of money, who lived an apparently quite normal, even modestly successful life for 30 years, all the while harboring her fantasy as certainty, and then in her 50s marched into her local bank and demanded the money she felt she was owed, suddenly revealing that she'd been mad all along. It's 30 years almost to the month since I published my first novel, and I, like the woman in Leader's book, have just openly revealed my writerly madness. In my case, it stems, of course, from the readerly experience aforementioned, from my own readerly experiences, from the fact that the wax on the soles of Emma Bovary's satin shoes, or Gabriel Conroy's awkwardness after ribbing Lily the maid about a bow, or the way B. Dowd in Alice Munro's unforgettable story Vandals performatively splashes the water with her hands when entering the lake to swim, just like my Canadian mother did. I can see B. Dowd, or is it my mother, doing exactly that. And the way her lover Ladner mockingly imitates her behind her back. These and 1,000 other details do live in my memory, as though I'd experienced them in my body. They are fully known to me. The title of my talk, of course, is Where Did the Time Go? And it might appear, as is my wont, that I've digressed. In fact, of course, everything is connected. Narrative exists in time. We can only read words over time and come to a full understanding in time, unlike images which we can apprehend in their entirety, if not in full detail, almost at once. And literature is always inevitably about time, its management and its effects, both in the subject and the form of the text. Our impression of a narrative evolves in the reading, in time, so that we understand characters and events differently at different moments and can form a full impression only after we come to the text's end. And of course, the conversation earlier about the farm boy from Idaho and the black kid from Roxbury who come to Harvard and come out someone else, both of them altered by the experience. We don't know who they are till it's over, till the end of the story. Space on the page, when writing and reading, measures writerly and readerly attention, and each writer selects the balance of scene and summary, of present and history, of exteriority and interiority, out of which to construct our stories. Memory is at the heart of the 20th and 21st century novel, as Novalis so wisely observes in the line Penelope Fitzgerald uses as the epigraph to The Blue Flower. Literature arises out of the shortcomings of history. And even as my character Chloe Cassar insists that the past swirls along with and inside the present, and all time exists at once around us, she makes this assertion, I make this assertion, from within an ordered understanding that there is decidedly a past, a present, and along with these, perforce, a future. The assertion is analogous to Beckett's line about God that we so love at our house, the bastard, he doesn't exist, enacting the contradictions of faith and faithlessness. Chloe asserts that all time exists at once because she knows that strictly speaking it cannot. She knows, I know, the difference between external reality and interiority. Rationally, we know that to hear in one's head one's dead mother's voice is not an indication that the dead woman has arisen from her grave. In Darien leaders' terms, we are therefore not mad. But technology, of course, is changing us in ways both known and unacknowledged. When, in 2019, I read Valeria Luiselli's novel Lost Children Archive, I came across the following lines with a profound sense of recognition. Something changed in the world. Not too long ago, it changed, and we know it. We feel time differently. No one has been quite able to capture what is happening or say why. Perhaps it's just that we sense an absence of future because the present has become too overwhelming, so the future has become unimaginable. And without future, time feels like only an accumulation. I wonder if it has felt this way also to anyone here. A sense of overwhelmedness, as Luiselli remarks, in the present, which makes the future hard to imagine. Yes, indeed. But more than that, in my lived experience, it feels as though the categories have collapsed, as if past and present are no longer fully distinguishable, with the resulting impression that we are mired. As if, indeed, the swirling of time to which my character Chloe refers has hardened into constraining immobility. Even as technological advances hurtle forward, it seems that soon all of us, thinkers and artists alike, will be replaced by AI, the way all the friendly immigrant restaurant servers in the UK have been replaced since Brexit by QR codes. Our sense of human possibility seems gravely diminished, and time, as Luiselli observes, a mere accumulation. She suggests that as of 2019, nobody had explained quite why our sense of time had changed, nor what it may mean. To the former, the reasons behind our changed sense of time, I'd note that we are in a digital age literally stuck in the present in ways that were previously unimaginable. The parallel semi-reality in which we live alongside our physical reality is one in which nothing ever goes away. The past never becomes the past. Consider that you can look up a restaurant's website online, select from the menu the items you'd like to order, and then discover that the restaurant has been defunct for several years. Consider that the Instagram account of our bereaved friend's adolescent son, who died suddenly in his sleep 6 years ago of an undiagnosed heart condition at the age of 17, is still up. You can summon his posts as if he were still living, simply not aging, eternally, insouciantly smiling. Consider that my Comcast email account warns me repeatedly that it's full to more than 98% capacity, with over 12,000 emails in the inbox, and that soon it will cease altogether to receive or send correspondence, because the detritus of more than a decade has piled up in a virtual garbage dump that is my life. And consider that my only possible response is to abandon the email address altogether and to begin again under another name, the way hoarders stuff their houses to the gills with the junk of decades, and rather than clear it all out, eventually simply shut the door, walk away, and begin hoarding elsewhere. The practical consequences of this failure to make the past go away are legion, not simply confusion about where to go for supper. In the case of someone like Al Franken, a former politician and comedian before that, quite good at both things, for whom a flippant sexist joke of 30 years ago was the cause of his downfall at the height of the Me Too movement, there's no possibility of redemption because reminders of this offense will never go away. I believe, someone here will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that under Napoleonic law, someone who serves time for a crime purges that crime with their penance, and that after their release, you cannot no longer have that crime held against you, nor technically even mentioned in public. I believe that's the case with Napoleonic law. How different in a digital era are the ethics of guilt? No future freedom is conceivable for the guilty when Google will push their crimes indefinitely into the public eye. As Stephen Kern points out in his 1983 book, The Culture of Time and Space, 1880 to 1918, the rapid advent of technological advances in that period, a little over a century ago, caused notable disruptions in conceptions of time and space. Whereas for all human memory, two people separated in space were also separated in time, 2 days' journey by horse and carriage, a lengthy sea voyage of weather-determined duration, and so forth. Suddenly, with the advent of the radio, the telephone, and the telegram, they were confusingly conjoined in time, but not in space. Whereas since the invention of the wheel, distance had been measured in horsepower, suddenly the combustion engine and what it enabled, trains, cars, eventually planes, rockets, collapsed the relationship of physical distance to time at ever-increasing speeds. The revolutionary consequences of these technological advances were manifest in thought and culture in all disciplines, among them in the sciences, Einstein's theories of relativity, philosophy, Bergson's theory of la durée, literature, Woolf, Joyce, and Proust, to name a few, and art, Cubism, Surrealism, Dadaism, etc. Kern is not the only person to note the importance of practical technological discoveries for the great intellectual advances of the time. Peter Gallison notes in his 2000 essay, Einstein's Clocks, the Place of Time, in which he connects Einstein's theories of relativity to the practical changes around him in Bern, where the city's clocks were being synchronized to standardize the train schedules across Europe. Quote, "I was standing in a northern European train station, absent-mindedly staring at the turn-of-the-century clocks that lined the platform. They all read the same to the minute. Curious, good clocks. But then I noticed that as far as I could see, even the staccato motion of their second hands was in synchrony. These clocks were not simply running well, I thought. These clocks are coordinated. Einstein must have seen such coordinated clocks while he was grappling with his 1905 paper, trying to understand the meaning of distant simultaneity." The consequences of recent technological advances in the last 50 years are easily as radical, and with the rapid progress of AI constantly evolving, and they too have again revolutionized our relationship to time and space, even as they've synchronized our external clock time to the fractions of seconds. We expect to find answers to our most abstruse questions online instantly. We expect with FaceTime and Zoom to be able not only to speak to people half a world away, but to see them in real time. But also, as I said earlier, our relationship to the progress of time has been rewritten. We've become, in the last 15 or so years, unable to pull free of the accumulations of the past. We're hemmed in online by now 2 or more decades of our histories and daily inundated with a tsunami of advertising of various sorts, both official and on Instagram in the form of human advertorial, as that platform is pure advertising. I feel that capitalism lingers under every talk here, so that it seems there's no way forward and no way out. Consider, if you will, that young adults now in their 20s or younger have little or no memory of life before these platforms. This is the world that has conditioned and shaped their brains and their ways of thought. To return to the quotation from Valeria Luiselli and to her 2 questions, why our sense of time has changed and what it may mean, I'd like now to try to address the latter issue. Speaking as a novelist, I propose that the collapse of our sense of time has been, at least in part, precipitated by the unacknowledged changes in our experience of narrative brought about by the internet and social media, and that the result of these changes is perplexingly, and this is my Kantian moment, tantamount to the death of hope. Hope, that crucial Enlightenment virtue, and something that at this stage we can ill afford to be without. As we've said, over a century ago, across European and North American culture, practical changes brought about in daily life, brought about by the technological advances, led to new understandings of time, space, and their relation to one another, including the end of Newtonian physics, the explosion of traditional perspective in painting. These are the artists whom I referred before, the rejection of omniscient third-person narrative in fiction. After all these shifts were well underway, Paul Valéry, in his 1936 lecture, Le Bilan de l'Intelligence, observed that on account of the technological transformations, I'm not going to read it in French, but the translations are my own. We no longer see the past in the way a son looks to his father, from whom he can learn something, but in the way a man looks at a child. So that's the end of the quote. It's a situation mirrored, of course, in our present day, and I can say this from personal experience as someone whose grown children regard me indeed as a child. Valéry goes on to remark upon the speed and overstimulation of the overturned society around him and asks whether this prodigiously transformed world, terribly upset by so much force applied with such imprudence, can arrive rapidly at a tolerable equilibrium. In other words, can the mind extricate us from the state in which it has put us? These questions are no different almost a century later, and one quakes at the ominous moment in the mid-1930s in which he raised them. Part of his talk is to assert that young people, he was then in his 60s, that young people did not want to listen to what he had to say because it predated all the technological advances. 1936 was not a great moment not to be listening to the lessons of history. So one quakes rather at a time when, as today, populations manipulated by propaganda and misinformation, unable to find equilibrium, gravitated either to the far left or the far right. And as the center could not hold, this instability gave rise to war. Now, as then, we need to look not simply at the manifest effects of our technological surge, our strange relation to time which Luiselli describes, but also at the reasons behind it. Valerie wisely points out that the functioning of our mind can be considered an irregularly constituted suite of unconscious productions and conscious interventions. Mentally, we are comprised of a succession of transformations of which some, the conscious ones, are more complex than others, the unconscious ones. In other words, to deploy the lingo of that old enemy, Donald Rumsfeld, our minds are shaped by known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. We might put into the middle category the known unknowns, the effects of the present culture that we have unwittingly internalized. We are perforce shaped today by a digitally transformed culture that's become predominantly visual rather than verbal. We've all heard the statistics telling us that we see more images in a day than our forebears saw in their lifetimes. We apprehend each image on our iPhone in its entirety at speed in an unrelated succession. Thanks to TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, now called X, and so forth, our brains are increasingly wired to replace narrative storytelling with visual experiences neither logical nor chronological, but rather comprised of a random accumulation without motive or meaning. Just try to retrieve in your memory the order in which you've encountered digital information, and if you're like me, you'll find it all but impossible. One thinks of E.M. Forster's book, Aspects of the Novel, one of the early craft books, in which he makes his famous hierarchical distinction between story and plot, where the former is merely a series of incidents and the latter born of motivation. The story, says Forster, is the king died, the queen died. The plot, he continues, is the king died, the queen died of grief. The difference narratively is between and then and why. And then being the pointlessly hurtling plots of, say, Marvel action films, and the why being a matter of psychology. Scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or randomly surfing online generally, of course, makes Marvel action films seem narratively profound. We've long noted the impatience that has resulted from our devices, our attention spans we all complain are fried. But more than that, by force of daily habit, we come to believe that narrative progression simply isn't necessary, that the rational unfolding of events in time is somehow a quaint vestige of previous centuries. In Forster's terms, we've lost the plot. The New York Magazine review of my new novel was headlined, "Claire Messud Writes Novels for Another Century." And the young reviewer suggested that the very undertaking, presumably in having a large historical canvas and unfolding chronologically, was antediluvian. Our tolerance for the fragmentary or oblique is ever expanding, our concern for precision of prose and the clarity of logic ever diminishing. We turn increasingly to the subjective, essential since modernism, and the highly impressionistic, a newer development, to oblique collage, our minds so fundamentally trained to expect fragmentation and the fracturing of logic that we grow increasingly suspicious of consistent argument or exposition. While it seems absurd to say in this room of brilliant scholars that we risk as a culture losing our capacity for sustained narrative and rational argument, we need to consider not the precious and rarefied communities of which we are privileged to be a part, but kids in school or young adults for whom, as Valérie points out, le milieu et l'époque ont sur eux autant et plus d'influence que les éducateurs. The milieu or the era have as much as or more influence than do educators upon them. I've been fortunate to teach some very fine students over the past decade at Harvard, and even they struggle. Their minds have been formed not above all by lengthy connected narratives, but by floods of disjointed images. A recent thesis student of mine, a serious student, privileged too, the child of, not counting as diverse, I think, the child of professional parents who met while themselves students at Harvard, asked me to suggest a long novel to read over the December break. I proposed Anna Karenina. "Oh, really?" she replied, wrinkling her nose. "I've heard Tolstoy's terrible, so long, so boring, so much work." She's an English concentrator who wants to be a fiction writer. More than impatience, increasingly young people convey a sense that sustained narrative is artificial and hence somehow dishonest, that only the fragmentary can come close to capturing contemporary human experience. If in literature the perspectival shift from the 19th to the 20th century was from the third person omniscient to the first person, what might be termed a move to the interior, then the shift in the 21st century arguably involves the fragmentation of the subject altogether, the breaking up of the I, a mere agglomeration of shards. The elusive, all but invisible first-person narrator, significantly and brilliantly instigated or introduced by W.G. Sebald at the turn of the 21st century, has had enormous influence upon writers in the subsequent years with variable literary effects. This has coincided, it's a bit like the success of Knausgaard, and all I have to say to my students, I love reading Knausgaard, but it's like Jackass, don't try this at home. Don't try this at home. This has coincided with the blurring of boundaries between fiction and memoir, as well as with the breaking up of text into brief, seemingly movable sections, on some level not unlike online posts on Instagram, which are now a prevalent mode in contemporary fiction. Not to mention, of course, a widespread preference for the present tense. On the one hand, we can observe this evolution, these trends in literature quite straightforwardly. This is simply how we evolve as we become an ever more visual, ever speedier, and more overwhelmed society. Observation doesn't call for opinion or value judgment. It's just where we're headed. But perhaps to stop there is to abdicate our responsibility as storytellers, those who weigh the responsibilities and effects of storytelling. We tell stories to communicate to one another, and though one might be forgiven for thinking otherwise, its fundamental purpose is, even now, more social than personal. This will seem like an odd leap. The trauma therapist, saying it's social, not personal, but the trauma therapist Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, explains that, quote, the nature of a traumatic experience is that the brain doesn't allow a story to be created. According to his research, we re-experience traumatic events in the present tense in fragmentary form. Indeed, we experience them in the very manner of telling that characterizes much contemporary narrative. Van der Kolk asserts that the way we surmount trauma is to process the experience so that we can recount it as a coherent narrative in the past tense. As he put in a 2021 interview with Krista Tippett, you know, the nice thing about trauma, if there's such a thing as a nice thing about trauma, is that you can process the memory and leave it behind. If a particular thing happens, you can help the mind and the brain to say, yes, it happened, but it happened a long time ago. But he goes on, right now, we're living in a world where nothing belongs to the past. In short, he suggests that the distinctions between past, present, and future are essential to our sanity, to the processing of trauma. And this is not, by the way, to suggest that all narrative is trauma narrative. But it is to make a correlation between what telling all to sort of make a generalization maybe about what all kinds of storytelling can do in different arenas with different purposes. You know what its function is. I propose that this is so not only for individuals, but for society as a whole. Think, for example, of France and the ways in which de Gaulle created for the French people a story of the Second World War that permitted them to move on from that trauma. I mean, a story in which essentially he was telling everybody they'd been in the resistance even when they had not, and that this made everybody feel it was okay to put the past behind them. And then think, on the other hand, that no analogous story has been created about the Algerian War, and that its wounds are raw even today, more than 60 years after it ended. Note that van der Kolk claims that these distinctions have eroded. We're living in a world where nothing belongs to the past. I believe, he said this during the pandemic, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by the statement, but novelist that I am, I understand it in the ways I've spoken of today. Culturally, to proceed, we need to be able to construct coherent, detached accounts of our experience. It's akin to folding outgrown clothes and storing them in the attic. Attendant upon our current inability to accomplish this, an inability even to put our stories in the past tense, let alone to make them cohere, we get stuck in a plotless loop, is an inability to allow for a future. It's not even about imagining it. Thanks to technology, futurist ideas exist in alternate realities in the virtual world, which spill over uneasily into our physical reality. This strange sci-fi of the now renders the future, too, like the past, indistinguishable from the present. The breakdown of time into an all-consuming present demands that each of us resist. Rational thought demands it. Hope for the future demands it. That it may prove a losing battle doesn't make it any less crucial. We must strive for coherence. We must strive for a perspective beyond the most subjective. We must strive for an ordering of thought that transcends the hoarder's morass of our historical moment. I contend that we should resist the online platforms that devalue words. I'm almost at the point of believing that we should write by pen on paper, that we should just be writing, yeah. I do too. I write my novels with a pen on paper. But you know, it's a big issue at the universities about exams. I feel like just have them write on paper with a pen. That's not so hard. Then you'll know that AI, that ChatGPT did not write it. Anyway, this isn't new. I know Paul Valéry made similar curmudgeonly complaints almost a century ago, lamenting that we can no longer support duration. We don't know how to render boredom fertile. Our nature has a horror of the void, which sounds like today. I mean, it sounds like, I might have said that this morning. What's new, though, is the degree of acceleration, the intense dominance of the visual over the verbal, the unrelenting meaninglessness of that addictive visual culture constantly in hand, literally in hand, not at hand, in hand, constantly distracting. Eventually, we who deal in narrative may be like medieval monks, sequestered in our enclosures, entirely separated from the world outside, maybe here at the Einstein Forum. But still, I maintain that telling stories about human life on this planet as profoundly and with as much nuance as possible is important. I've staked my life on it. Such stories involve time unfolding in all directions in our minds, to be sure, but in reality, only ever in one direction. That's the truth of human life, and we disregard it at our peril. Okay, I think often of my 2019 visit to Pella, and now you can tell me, Glenn, A-E-G-A-E, Ige? Aegea, okay, thank you. Present-day Vergina outside Thessaloniki. The mosaics and artifacts at Pella, where Alexander the Great was raised in the 4th century BC and taught by Aristotle, are of course stupendous, but even they are modest when compared to the artworks found in the tomb of Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, at Aegea. Online it gave me a hard G, Aegea. That's like the Aegean, I can do that. In the modern town of Vergina in 1977, these pieces, from the large frescoes to the gold filigree work of the royal crowns to the miniature ivory carvings that adorned Philip's daybed for the afterlife, are of an astounding vitality and beauty. I then visited the Archaeological Museum in Thessaloniki and was shocked to see the work produced in the region 400 years later, around the time of Christ. All the brilliance had been lost. Sophisticated, truthful beauty had given way to clumsy, primitive endeavor. It took another 400 years, almost 800 years after Philip's death, to reach the Byzantine period, characterized by glorious mosaics, but even they are far from the naturalness and delicacy of the art of Aegea. It's not until the Renaissance that humans reach again a comparable level of artistic accomplishment, over 1,700 years after the civilization of Philip and Alexander. 1,700 years in the wilderness. It can happen. I'll conclude in paradox, which is perhaps where I've been hovering all along. Even as I insist upon the particular importance of words, I'm sharing a photograph with you. And even as I'm talking about how narrative must allow for the separation of time, I'm showing you this photograph because in a way that's different from what I've been talking about, this image collapses time. It's a picture I took of a tiny ivory relief carving from the daybed that accompanied Philip in his tomb. And there were several hundred, I think, or certainly dozens, on that daybed. In real life, it's only about 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters. So you have to picture, it's yay big. It's yay big. But it's unbelievably richly alive. To look at it, to notice Dionysius's slightly flaring nostrils, his amused expression, his tensed buttocks, the woman's delicate hand resting upon his at her neck, the rolled bracelet on her wrist, the shirring of fabric above and below the indentation of her navel, the barely noticeable intimation of her nipples beneath her gown, brings me into human communion with my forebears of 2,500 years ago. I know they are of then, not to be confused with now. Even as I know in my body, as I know when I remember Emma Bovary's waxed satin shoes, or Gabriel Conroy's awkwardness, or B. Dowd's flapping gestures, that in their familiar humanity, they touch me now. A momentary and meaningful collapse of past and present is part of what art most wonderfully can achieve. My character Chloe's assertion that the past swirls always around us. But as I've been attempting to explore, that's not the same as a general, chronic, and paralyzing collapse of categories of time. When I look at this tiny carving, of course, I wish I were a visual artist rather than someone whose medium is words. But I'm also reminded that it's possible to reach across time in language as in images without denying time's passage.
David, you have the first question. Please signal to me. No, David Schulman, if you have others.
Thank you. It's not exactly a question, but your description, lyrical and yet very upsetting in a way, of this accelerated time into eternal present, it reminded me of something that I've been working on recently. Perhaps you know this. There were Ismaili Neoplatonic philosophers in the 10th and 11th century writing in Arabic and Persian, and they were fascinated by time. And they had a lot of unusual things to say about time. For example, I think if I heard you right, you said you can't have all of time at a particular moment, but actually they didn't think that. They think it's quite possible for us to experience eternity, which is in movement. That's what they say. It's a movement. It's a very slow movement, actually, but you can actually hear it moving, and what it sounds like is tough, tough, tough. You can hear that if you attune your ears to it, But that's not our usual time, which is what they call waqt or wacht. That's everyday time, which runs along in a kind of linear cycle or something like that. But the really important thing is not this dichotomy, eternity and everyday time, but they have another notion of time, which is actually rather beautiful. They call it daimumiyat, which means alwaysness. There's such a thing as alwaysness. And that's an actually it comes out of the Greek Neoplatonists, actually. They've taken it from there. But they've extended it a lot. Alwaysness means it's a kind of emergent time. It's emerging at every moment. And it's alive, and it's in some sense also dependent upon us as the people who experience it. In a way, we create it together. And that's what they think is real time. That's what time consists of. So I was as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, maybe what you're describing is a kind of modern version of alwaysness.
That's wonderful. I hope not, though. I hope that that sort of internet presentness isn't alwaysness. I don't know. That seems alarming. I mean, it's interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about Bergson's durée, and of course, the philosophical. Last year, I taught a class with a physicist friend and colleague about time, and we had a row about Einstein and Bergson. As you may know, Einstein and Bergson had a set-to in 1922 at a conference in Paris, and her response was, "What is the point of asking the students to read Bergson? He was just wrong. Einstein was right and Bergson was wrong." And I kept saying, but if you take it within literally, strictly speaking, he was wrong to deny theories of relativity. But if you look at his writing about the interior and individual experience of time, which is, in a way, it isn't alwaysness quite, because that's communal. I mean, it's the opposite of what you're saying, but it is elastic, right? So that a moment can sort of, we can translate it simply into sort of Wolf's moments of being, if you want, right? Some sense that the time, or Man, the fact that the first week of the Magic Mountain takes whatever it is, 200 pages in the next years, which is sort of what life is like, right? I don't think there's anyone in the room who's still at the first week takes hundreds of pages anymore. But for her, that had all that, for my physicist friend, and colleague, all that counts is what's measurable. So it's interesting that the idea that there's a sort of not measurable consensus time. That's a sort of lovely.
Didn't Bergson say that time is a device to keep everything from happening all at once?
That's great.
Aleda?
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I was reminded of the title of a book called Stranded in the Present. It's this sense of time that the present is extending endlessly, and actually, it's impossible to leave anything behind, and this has to do with the internet. Actually, in 2014, a new legal, a law was made which is called the right to be forgotten in the European Union, and it has exactly addresses this issue that you have negative reports on you, that you have debts or whatever, and they have to be actually cancelled in order to allow for a new future for these people, or you're out of prison and you are no longer registered with that history. So that is already addressed, I think, which is interesting. But another thing is
Not in the US, probably.
yeah. The other thing has to do with the fact that nothing disappears, but I have also the experience that over the last years, actually throughout my life, what I noticed was that past reappears. What about the reappearing of past? So first of all, what I witnessed in the 1980s, it was the return of the witnesses speaking about the Holocaust. You called it a second coming. So that was a reappearance of the past. Right now, with the Humboldt Forum here in Berlin, I had a similar experience. There was this beautiful castle. We were supposed to think of the great Prussian Empire, but then there was the Humboldt Forum, and this, from my point of view, is exactly the mémoire involontaire as Proust conceived it. So it was an involuntary memory. It was there. So it was the past reappearing. It was not called back. It was not desired to come back. But it was there. So do you have any category for these reappearing of the past? Is that also something that you can relate to?
Yes, the question of the reappearing past, in internet terms, what comes to mind is, your phone, banal as it is, your phone sends you memories. This is where you were 4 years ago. This is what you were doing on this day, in 2014. So that's a very curious. That's like AI taking over your involuntary memory. It is involuntarily recalled to you. I sort of hate that. Yeah, but I think the fact of history returning in the way that you're speaking of is maybe I'm not a philosopher of time, but it seems to me something that has occurred over the long history of time. That it's part of us. It's consistent with a human experience extending backwards, centuries. That involuntary memory, both in the individual and in a community, and potentially even a culture, that might happen. Maybe I'm speaking from the naive position of my post radio and television, media culture, as opposed to the internet culture, but already from a time when there were reminders. I don't know what reminders there. I mean, to go back to Aegea, one of the things that I just, in the most banal tourist way, like it blows my mind. You see these mosaics at Pella, and they're absolutely magnificent, and you think, who was the dope who thought, let's just leave that and wander down the hill and build some mud huts? Like, what the heck? What was going on humanly there? And I'm sure there were, maybe there was war, maybe there was famine, maybe there was drought, whatever, some combination of things that caused people to move away. But once they had moved away, they obviously didn't have the reminders. They didn't have the involuntary memory of the culture that they'd abandoned, or they might have tried to retrieve some of it.
Susan.
I want to respectfully disagree with Elida that the return of the Humboldt Forum was involuntary. It was a voluntary reactionary project that was desired. No, but I mean, this was the joke. The idea was to wipe out every memory of the DDR, to rebuild this reactionary monument.
Yeah, that's what her point was.
Yes. It brought this history back. They didn't be reactionary, didn't want this history back. They didn't even think about it.
Right, they didn't think about it. Okay, all right, okay, fine. Okay, it's, as those of us who follow Berlin politics know, this is a really long and I find deeply funny story, but that wasn't really what I wanted to say to Claire. Claire, that was an absolutely wonderful talk and resonating in so many ways. With my darker thoughts at the moment, I must confess. And the ending that, it might take another 1,700 years until kids. I read Anna Karenina on the bloody subway in New York when I was 17, commuting from my job downtown and going to City College at night, and it was marvelous. So anyway, okay. Question is this: it's odd for me to find myself defending a technological innovation. But your poignant remark about your friend's son's social media not disappearing brought to mind the fact that I recently noticed as my address book in my iPhone keeps multiplying, that I have the telephone numbers of several people who have died, who were very important to me in different ways. And I cannot bring myself to delete their phone numbers. And there's something comforting about the fact that they're still on my phone. And I wonder if you can work that. I mean, of course, I know they won't pick up if I call, and probably I'll just get this number doesn't exist. But I wonder how that works into your...
I mean, I absolutely understand that. I think what's strange to me is the public nature of an Instagram account. The fact that somebody might now Daniel may speak about the adaptive algorithm and might say that the dead person's Instagram will never be suggested for you. That could be the case, but there is some, I think some sense that in the way that the restaurant that no longer exists can come up for you, the idea that there is a sort of ghost presence existing online is quite strange. It's a different situation, but in researching this novel, which, as you may have gathered, it involves a fair amount about the Pied Noir community. One of the things that's quite interesting is that because of the advent of the internet coincided with a certain age among the people in the Pied Noir community, who then went and you can find almost like a virtual city. You can find a virtual Algiers of 1955 or 1960 online. You can. I mean, I've seen pictures of. I can see the archway, the street. There's the street where my dad grew up. He lived 2 doors down. If I could just hop in the picture and and turn the corner. But there are people have posted the classroom photos from all the different years at particular schools and so on. So it is the equivalent of not just keeping your late friends in your phone. It's recreating in a virtual world community that ceased to exist certainly by 1962 and largely well before that, and for reasons of necessity and and justice. So it's quite a complicated. I feel as though as they tell us at Harvard about ChatGPT, it's a tool. It's a tool. A hammer, you can use a hammer to build something, and you can use it to knock a wall down. It's a tool. It's neutral. So yeah, and it's true. So I mean, you can say that these technological advances are the reality, and we have to figure out, each of us, how best they serve us. But I do have an anxiety about the as the nature of online reality becomes increasingly internalized, especially by a younger generation, what the consequences are going to be for narrative, right? For how we make an argument or tell a story. I have real anxiety about that. So.
Leah.
Yeah, thank you. So that actually really follows on this theme, because I really agree with you, and I'm equally upset and worried by this return to presentism in literature and the fact that everything becomes the I that tells the story in the present. And I was thinking, though, whether there is something that explains it, which is the skepticism about intermediaries. So there's a kind of critique of ideology gone extreme, which is that every interpretation is going to be some form of power exercise, whereby the only way in which I can be authentic and true and tell a story that's sincere is actually by just saying it in the first person present most of the time. And whether there is a kind of parallel to that in the political realm, which is, again, the disappearance of intermediaries in the political realm, whereby it's always about the individual kind of making statements about the world, but without a kind of collective ability to articulate those claims and to present them and to give them the form of a kind of long-term project. So I was really just thinking that it seems to me more than the kind of loss of the future, the problem is that we have kind of lost our capacity to think politically and collectively about the future in a way that just stretches beyond the individual and their stance on the world. So
100%. I so agree with you. And in fact, you know, Sebald said in a conversation with my husband James just before the turn of the 20th century, he said, I write in the first person because I cannot any longer accept a third-person omniscient point of view. That's ethically impossible to do, and that for him, rather than writing entirely about himself, he had created narrators who appear only in the periphery. But it is a really it is a very powerful constraint, and there is also the sort of, this is a very not Einstein forum analogy, but I'm often thinking about like the Christian Dior to Topshop trickle down, right? Like I feel as though there's a trickle down of that, which is I think not ethically considered but is simply just a sense of this is the way we do things now, and I think it does also relate to this I've lost my train of thought. To struggle, right? I think it is an issue of the difference between of being in a position of struggle and a position of authority, and nobody wants actually to be in a position of authority. Nobody wants to be making statements that might seem like blanket statements that might, that might contain generalizations that are untrue. That might, I mean, it doesn't feel, I think, in our moment appropriate to do that, and yet arguably we need some people to do that in order to even just spark debate, for heaven's sake. But yeah,
I have 4 people on my list, of whom I'm the first. Your wonderful talk bore the title "Where Did the Time Go?" As though what is going is the only time that there has ever been or that could exist. And I wonder whether a better title might not be "Where Did a Time Go?" That is to say, you give an elegy for a certain experience of human temporality, which is in the process of transformation now, but which has perhaps not always been there, and which was dependent upon certain technological and social and experiential factors. Imagine a purely oral society before writing. They had a different sense of time, and they told different kinds of stories. Then there's writing, then there's all kinds of other technological innovations which have affected the sense of time. You have an investment in a particular mode of temporality.
I do.
Sorry?
I do.
Of course. And it's natural that you should feel at risk when that particular mode of temporality is in the process of transformation. You emphasize what is lost if it goes. But whenever something is lost, there are new possibilities that come in. And it would be wonderful for you, with your experience and expertise, to think about new possibilities which are opened up by these technological advantages, rather than simply telling an elegy about what is being lost.
Absolutely. I entirely agree. I think there's no question. Interestingly, I could probably make a case for the Enlightenment being the time after which my sense of time, as it were, my sense of the passage of time came into common currency. I think that's, and I absolutely agree. You know, that to look hopefully and innovatively at the possibilities for narrative going forward. And I think people are doing that. There is this sort of corollary for me about the privileging of the image over the word. And I can tell that just in the syntax of my students' sentences and the vocabulary. And this for me is a real, so you know, I know that colonialism has come up in various people's talks. I am an entirely colonial product. My mother was Canadian. My father was a French colonial. I was a child in Australia and Canada. I went to a Church of England schools. And when I read a novelist who has the same education as me, I recognize the syntax of those sentences, right? And they are bloody beautiful sentences. And they are also, at the most basic level, the product of colonialism. You know, that comes out of a sort of British imperial history. That a certain sense of the hierarchy, right, of the compound complex sentence that is using phrases and clauses to write something that is capacious and lucid. You know, I love a good sentence. But I feel like that marks me as you know, colonial to the marrow. So I think there's absolutely a case too for saying we need to jettison all that and find a new way of narrative. But I don't have the answers. So I guess for me, there is, in terms of lamenting what is being lost, for me there is a sense, you know, I'm just going to put it out there, as many of you may know, Racine, vocabulary, 8,000 words. Shakespeare, vocabulary, 24,000 words, at play in the fields of the Lord. And now people are writing with a 7th grade vocabulary. And if you know, and there, it's as if you were given unbelievable diversity, and then we're told, no, we'll just keep it on this little table. You just forget about the rest of town. And that to me is I understand that images speak in a different way, but that loss is a real loss.
The gentleman with the microphone.
Hi. Yeah, so I feel like an aspect of what you were sharing was sort of how much technology has changed, or like almost a core part here was how much technology has changed our sense of time. And one story in that was that it's become harder, I guess, in some sense, to forget and to like be able to move on or have your narrative change. And I completely agree that I think technology has radically changed and is like a core part of our sense of time, but I think there's a bit more nuance than just this sense of like an eternal remembering, because there's a counter narrative that's especially salient in like technology today, which is also a creating of a eternal present from technology, but more through a forgetting. And so there's a few kinds of dynamics at play there, but you know, it's been pointed out that like on, you know, Netflix and things like that, there's less films available than at your typical suburban blockbuster from like 20 years ago. And there's another sense in which the volume of material has made the focus become very much on the present. So there's like, you know, there's years worth of content uploaded to YouTube every day. And so there's a sense in which all of our like algorithmic timelines are very much emphasizing what's happening in this moment. Many people have started to notice in the last few years, search is becoming worse and worse. It's becoming much harder to find older content and the archival quality of the web. So if anything, there's actually more of an orality or more of an eternal present and stories we tell in the present about what we think maybe the past was like. But with this mix in of a strange algorithmic associative memory of these moments where then something resurfaces out of the archives kind of unbidden. So like there's this, I do feel like the technologically mediated time is a bit more like richness to it or something.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to say, as you're describing this, which is so true, I think, certainly to my experience, and I'm picturing the silt blowing in and covering the mosaics in Aegea, you know, in Pella, right? And just until it becomes impossible to tell there was ever anything there at all, you know, and maybe that's just the rhythm of the earth, but it is moving a lot faster. Yeah.
Three more one-sentence questions. Ben?
Right. So I wanted to reflect on the connection between history, memory, and storytelling.
In one sentence.
The sentence will go like this. Memory seems to wish to get promoted to history in order to gain in legitimation, but this promotion has something to do with what kind of stories of what kind of people can be told, and is there a privileging of certain kinds of stories, such as victimhood narratives, which appear in this shortened version.
Thank you, Ben.
Yes, I mean, I would just say quickly that I think I agree that the memory and history, the blurring of memory and history, I think it ties into what Leah was raising, in this question of, who is willing to sort of step outside the subjective, and is it possible to step outside the subjective, and what does it mean if we can't? And that enables that blurring, I think. Yeah.
Ava, one sentence.
No.
Ava.
Claire, thank you so much. I don't know why you doubted your presence here. I learned so much from your talk. I wanted just to go back on this notion of narratives. I think what you mean by narrative, but I'm not sure I understood very well, is something that captures life as a unity or something like that. I think certainly Anna Karenina or Proust's narrator have a kind of all-encompassing life, and you want the narrative to capture the richness or diversity of this life. I'm not exactly sure, but we live in a very different time period. We are different persons in a life. We move from one location to another. We have different partners and different jobs and so on and so forth. So at a very simple level, I want to say narratives have to reflect the fragmentation of our lives, but that makes me ask, what exactly is a good narrative of a life in this context, in our context today?
Thank you.
And
Ava.
the second thing is images versus words, but we have never written as much. Everybody has a blog today. So what exactly do you do with the fact that words have never been as present, written words have never been as present in our lives?
Thank you.
Thank you. I might answer the second, address the second first, which is, it's amazing how many of my students want to write, and amazing how few of them read. Mm-hmm. So if there are 1 billion words on the internet and 5 readers, it doesn't actually make a difference. I mean, that I think is really, for me, that part of that presentism is simply the patience that it takes to actually read a longer narrative. I think is, I mean, now I just sound curmudgeonly, I just sound like a granny. But I know young people who can't sit through an hour and a half film because that's too long to pay attention, and that's a very different sort of paying attention than reading a book. And that's something that comes directly from the speed of our technological. And that's, there's no sense railing against it. That's just the world that we are moving into, and you can't stop time. But I think that question of sort of more words, I think that's like, there are more clothes too. Does that mean design is in a good spot? I don't know. There are a lot more clothes than there ever were, and they're making mountains of them in African countries that take the garbage and in return for payment. That's a whole other story. But as for what I'm thinking of by narrative, I literally just mean a sort of a coherent and progressive narrative that could be nonfiction, so it could be essayistic, or in my case, it's fiction. I'm a fiction writer. It's not something that I don't object to. Any particular styles. I'm not saying things shouldn't be fragmentary, experiences are different. As I say, I've written a novel. I initially wanted to write 5 novels. My editor, about covering 1948, 5 short novels. I was like, they'll only be 200 pages each, covering 1940 to 2010. My editor was like, you get one. So I'm covering 70 years and 4 continents. It's not that I think that things should be in some holistic 19th century, 18th century way, nor that I think characters are that way. But it's an interesting. It's like you know, that moment. When did my pants get too tight? You know, it's like, what was the tipping point? I could do them up last week, and I can't do them up now. So where was the exact moment? Can I find the exact moment when they ceased to fit? I feel that, you know, in the increasing fragmentation of narrative, you know, at what point have we reached meaningless collage? I find that my students have a very high tolerance for murkiness, for a lack of lucidity. They have a very high tolerance for that because it doesn't, because they actually are suspicious of lucidity, which seems to them too glossy somehow, as though it's making a false narrative.
It restricts their freedom.
It restricts their freedom. So that's, I think it's the tipping. It's not that I'm objecting to evolutions in narrative form. It's more that I'm raising the question of at what point is it an emperor's new clothes situation where we're all applauding nonsense, just full-on nonsense, which can happen.
Philip, you get one last question today. One sentence.
Was I wrong to hear in some of the beautiful phrases you used about the collapse of time, to hear echoes of the beginning of Burnt Norton and the end of Little Gidding? And if I wasn't wrong, does that sort of worry the thesis that this is somehow a matter of a new technology, given that Eliot was writing that before the technological stuff arrived?
So how lovely that you heard those echoes. They were not deliberate, although as my father, were he still living, would have said, culture is what's left when you've forgotten everything. So so maybe in my sort of residual culture, there was my subconscious. Let's go with that. My subconscious was pushing an Eliot reference or two. But I think one of the things that I was trying to point out with the Valérie essay is that actually plus ça change. You know, that in some way the sky is falling. It's been falling. I'm sure you could find the 1835 or 1820 essay saying the sky is falling. But it is true that the changes, you know, each time the changes are different. And these are pretty. This moment, and we don't yet know, you know, how things will be in 20 years or 30 years. But this period is one of a significant sort of transition. Just the fact that there's that for all of us. Sorry, I'm talking too much. The conversation for another day. But that we all live with an alternate reality. Alongside us, the reality of emails and you know, but much more than that. I mean, we have children. Our 20-year-old son, less now, but the reality of video games was incredibly significant for him, and I can see that in the shaping of narrative understanding for my students, to my despair. So what does it mean to have an alternate reality that then allows you to think, you know, maybe I'm a squirrel, right? And there are people who think, you know, my soul is a squirrel, but you know, that's because you can move around in the body of a squirrel.
Cockroach. I mean, there is a tradition of that too.
There's a tradition of that too, but it was, you know, less.
Let me suggest that we thank both Rainey and Claire for their diverse and timely